On the morning of April 11, 1945, the gates of Buchenwald concentration camp creaked open to a world that had never truly imagined the horrors lying within. For years, the camp had been hidden behind barbed wire, guard towers, and the silence of fear. But on that day, the silence was shattered. American forces of the U.S. Third Army approached from the west, driving deeper into the collapsing Third Reich. They expected resistance. They expected chaos. What they didn't expect was the scene that unfolded before them, a place where humanity had been stripped to its barest, most fragile form. Buchenwald was not a death camp in the same way as Auschwitz or Treblinka. It had no gas chambers, no vast crematoria designed solely for extermination. Instead, it was a vast system of suffering, a labor camp, a prison, a holding pen for those the Nazi regime deemed enemies of the state. Jews, political dissidents, Soviet prisoners of war, resistance fighters, homosexuals, Roma. They all passed through Buchenwald's gates. Many would never leave. The official death toll was over 56,000, but the real number is likely higher. The camp was established in 1937 on the Ettersberg Hill near Weimar. Its name, Buchenwald, or Beech Forest, was chosen deliberately, a grotesque attempt to cloak brutality and pastoral imagery. The SS, under the watchful eye of Heinrich Himmler, oversaw its operation. It grew from a single camp into a sprawling complex, with more than 100 subcamps feeding forced labor to the Nazi war machine. Factories nearby produced weapons and equipment, using prisoners as expendable tools. Human lives were consumed as fuel for the Reich's ambitions. By 1945, Buchenwald was overcrowded beyond comprehension. Tens of thousands of prisoners crammed into wooden barracks, meant for a fraction of that number. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis claimed lives daily. Starvation reduced men to skeletal figures, their eyes hollow, their skin clinging to bone. The SS routinely carried out executions by shooting, hanging, or lethal injection. Medical experiments were conducted with sadistic precision. Prisoners were injected with pathogens, sterilized without anesthesia, mutilated in the name of science. And yet, even here, resistance burned. Buchenwald had one of the most organized prisoner underground movements of any Nazi camp. Communists, socialists, and other political inmates formed clandestine committees, smuggling information, sabotaging production, and even hiding children from transport lists. They created false records and forged documents. They risked death daily to preserve life and hope. As the Allies advanced into Germany, the Nazi regime began evacuating camps, forcing prisoners on brutal death marches deeper into the shrinking territory, still under their control. Thousands from Buchenwald were sent on these marches. Many perished from exhaustion, starvation, or execution if they faltered. But in the final weeks of the war, chaos within the camp increased. SS guards fled, leaving behind a skeleton crew and thousands of terrified prisoners. Rumors of liberation spread like wildfire. Some dared to believe. Others, having seen too much, dared not. In early April, the prisoner underground prepared for a moment they had dreamed of for years. They organized an uprising. Weapons were smuggled. Plans were drawn. And when the time came, as the Americans approached, they struck. On April 11, 1945, with the sound of artillery in the distance, prisoners overpowered the remaining guards, seizing the watchtowers and taking control of the camp before the arrival of the liberating forces. When the U.S. troops entered Buchenwald later that day, they were met not by resistance, but by the gaunt, skeletal faces of men who had freed themselves. The Americans were unprepared for what they found. Corpses lay in piles like cordwood. Survivors, too weak to stand, crawled from their bunks to greet the soldiers. The stench of death was overwhelming. In the crematorium, furnaces still smoldered, and ash covered the floor. In storerooms, heaps of human hair, piles of eyeglasses, and stacks of children's shoes bore silent witness to the industrial scale of the atrocity. Even hardened combat veterans wept openly at the sight. News of Buchenwald's liberation spread quickly. Journalists and photographers documented the horror for the world to see. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself insisted that every detail be recorded, that no one could ever deny what had happened. "Get it all on record now," he said. "Get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened." Among the prisoners liberated that day were figures who would later become significant voices in history. Elie Wiesel, who would go on to write Night and win the Nobel Peace Prize, was just 16 years old. The camp's youngest survivors, children hidden by the underground, would later testify to the courage and sacrifice of those who had risked everything to save them. But liberation was not the end of suffering. Many survivors were too weak to recover. Hundreds died in the days and weeks that followed, their bodies simply unable to withstand the toll of starvation and disease. Others faced a different kind of torment, the trauma of memory, the unbearable weight of what they had seen and endured. For many, freedom was only the beginning of a lifetime of nightmares. Buchenwald became a symbol, not just of Nazi cruelty, but of the resilience of the human spirit. The uprising showed that even in the darkest corners of human depravity, defiance could survive. The liberation revealed the full depth of Nazi crimes, forcing the world to confront the consequences of hatred, fanaticism, and indifference. And the testimonies of its survivors became part of the historical record, ensuring that the truth could never be buried. The day the gates opened was more than a moment in time. It was a reckoning, a confrontation between civilization and barbarism, memory and denial, life and death. It was a day when the world looked into the abyss and vowed, "Never again." But never again is a promise that must be renewed with each generation. The memory of Buchenwald is not confined to history books or memorial plaques. It is a warning, a lesson, a mirror held up to humanity. And as the last survivors pass from this world, their stories of suffering, resistance, and survival must be carried forward by those who remain. For on that cold April day, when the gates of Buchenwald finally swung open, it was not just a camp that was liberated, it was the truth. And truth, once revealed, must never be forgotten. The liberation of Buchenwald marked a turning point not only in the war, but in the world's understanding of evil itself. The soldiers who entered the camp on April 11, 1945, were not strangers to death. Many had fought their way across Europe, seen comrades fall, and witnessed the ruins left behind by the Nazi war machine. But nothing could have prepared them for the grotesque tableau that unfolded before their eyes. Everywhere they looked, there was evidence of suffering on an unimaginable scale. Barracks were filled with men too weak to rise, their bodies ravaged by starvation and disease. Some clutched at the soldiers' hands, murmuring words of gratitude in dozens of languages. Others stared in silence, their eyes hollow, as if unable to comprehend that the nightmare might finally be ending. In some cases, prisoners simply wept, not out of joy, but because their bodies, long accustomed to despair, no longer knew how to respond to hope. The Americans, hardened by battle, found themselves overwhelmed. Many would later speak of Buchenwald as the most haunting experience of their lives. One GI described the camp as a place where death had lost its meaning. Another said that he felt as though he had stepped into the gates of hell. The soldiers distributed what rations they could, but the doctors warned them to be careful. Food too rich, given too quickly to starving bodies, could kill. And so they set about the delicate task of saving lives, even as they struggled to understand the magnitude of what they had stumbled upon. In the days following liberation, the U.S. Army documented every aspect of the camp. Medical teams worked tirelessly to treat the sick. Investigators began compiling evidence of war crimes. Survivors were interviewed, and their testimonies recorded. The scale of Nazi cruelty became clearer with each passing day. More than 21,000 people were found alive in Buchenwald on the day of liberation. But for every one of them, there were many others who had perished. The crematorium, with its towering chimney, was perhaps the most chilling sight of all. Inside, soldiers found rows of ovens, still warm from recent use. Ash and charred bone fragments coated the floor. In one corner, they discovered a table used for measuring and cataloging gold teeth extracted from the dead. The SS had even kept meticulous records of how much gold had been harvested, a grotesque testament to the bureaucratic efficiency of genocide. Elsewhere, they found the bunker, a series of underground cells where prisoners were tortured and executed. Hooks and chains still hung from the walls. The stench of decay lingered in the air. In the camp's infirmary, medical instruments used in human experimentation were scattered across tables. Documents revealed that prisoners had been infected with typhus, exposed to toxic substances, and subjected to freezing experiments to study hypothermia. Others had been sterilized in attempts to develop methods for mass population control. These were not the actions of madmen operating in isolation. They were part of a deliberate system, sanctioned at the highest levels of the Nazi state. Yet, amid the horror, there were moments of profound humanity. Survivors who could still walk began helping those who could not. Former political prisoners took charge of organizing food distribution and sanitation efforts. Doctors among the inmates volunteered to assist the American medical teams. Slowly, life began to reassert itself within the walls of Buchenwald. One of the most striking aspects of the camp's liberation was the role of the children. Many had been hidden by the prisoner underground in secret compartments or disguised as adults to save them from transport to extermination camps. These children, some no older than 5 or 6, emerged from their hiding places blinking in the sunlight, bewildered but alive. Their presence was a living refutation of Nazi ideology, proof that even in the face of systematic annihilation, life could endure. As the survivors recovered, they began to speak. Their stories, told in halting voices, revealed the full extent of what had happened behind Buchenwald's gates. They spoke of brutal beatings and public executions. They described the tree hangings, where prisoners were suspended by their arms tied behind their backs until their shoulders dislocated. They told of guards setting dogs on inmates for sport, and of medical experiments that left victims screaming in agony. They also spoke of resistance, of the secret networks that had formed within the camp, of stolen scraps of food shared among the starving, of songs whispered in the night as acts of defiance. These stories complicated the narrative of victimhood. The prisoners were not merely passive sufferers. They were active agents of survival, even rebellion, in the face of overwhelming brutality. The liberation of Buchenwald quickly became a pivotal moment in the Allies' campaign to expose the full scale of Nazi crimes. Journalists, photographers, and filmmakers documented every detail. Their work was broadcast around the world, shocking audiences who had been largely unaware of the true nature of the concentration camp system. In the United States and Britain, newspapers ran front-page stories under headlines like "Nazi Horror Camp Found" and "Hell on Earth." Public opinion, already hardened against Germany, now turned to demands for justice. The Allied leadership responded swiftly. Plans for war crimes, trials accelerated. The evidence gathered at Buchenwald, The photographs, the documents, the testimony of survivors would later form part of the prosecution's case at Nuremberg. The SS officers who had run the camp were hunted down, tried, and in many cases, executed. Even ordinary guards and medical staff faced accountability for their roles in the machinery of oppression. But the reckoning extended beyond the perpetrators. Buchenwald forced ordinary Germans to confront the reality of what had been done in their name. The U.S. military ordered civilians from nearby Weimar to visit the camp. Hundreds of them were marched through the gates and shown the piles of corpses, the torture chambers, the crematorium. Many claimed ignorance. Some wept. Others turned away in silence. The message was clear. This was not just the work of a few fanatics. It was the product of a society that had allowed hatred to flourish unchecked. In the weeks after liberation, Buchenwald became a site of reflection as well as recovery. Memorial services were held for the dead. Survivors gathered to remember those who had not lived to see freedom. On April 19th, just days after the camp was liberated, they held a ceremony in the roll call square. There, they swore an oath, the Buchenwald Oath, pledging to fight fascism wherever it might rise again. "We will not rest," they declared, "until the last fascist is brought before the judges of the peoples." The oath was more than rhetoric. Many former prisoners dedicated their lives to that promise. Some became leaders in post-war governments. Others worked as educators, historians, and activists, ensuring that the memory of Buchenwald and the lessons it held would not fade. For them, the day the gates opened was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a new mission: to bear witness, to seek justice, and to warn future generations. The liberation also raised complex questions about humanity itself. How could such cruelty have taken root in a modern, industrialized nation? How could ordinary people have participated in, or ignored, such atrocities? And perhaps most troubling of all, could it happen again? These questions would haunt philosophers, theologians, and political thinkers for decades to come. The questions raised by Buchenwald were not abstract. They cut to the core of what it means to be human, and what happens when humanity is abandoned. The survivors who emerged from the camp bore physical scars that would never heal, but it was the psychological wounds that often proved most enduring. For many, liberation was not a moment of joy, but a disorienting confrontation with a world they no longer trusted. They had lived for years under constant threat, stripped of identity, dignity, and hope. Freedom, when it finally arrived, felt alien. Some did not know where to go. Their homes were gone, their families murdered, their communities erased. Many of the Jews who survived Buchenwald found themselves in displaced persons camps, waiting months or even years before they could emigrate to new countries. Others returned to their homelands, only to face indifference or hostility from neighbors who had collaborated with the Nazis or simply wished to forget. The trauma of Buchenwald did not end with liberation. It continued in the struggle to rebuild shattered lives. For the youngest survivors, the journey was especially difficult. Many were orphans, their parents murdered in ghettos, camps, or mass shootings. They had known nothing but hatred and violence for most of their lives. Humanitarian organizations stepped in to help, arranging for adoption, education, and relocation. Some children were taken to Palestine, others to the United States, Canada, or the United Kingdom. A few were even reunited with surviving relatives. Yet even as they built new lives, the ghosts of Buchenwald remained with them. Nightmares, flashbacks, and survivors' guilt haunted their waking hours. Elie Wiesel's story is emblematic of this struggle. At 16, he was liberated from Buchenwald, but his father had died just weeks earlier from exhaustion and dysentery. In his memoir, Night, Wiesel described the moment of liberation not as a triumph, but as an emptiness. From the depths of the mirror, a corpse was contemplating me. Like many survivors, He felt that part of him had died in the camp, and that the world needed to understand what had happened there. His words would later help shape global memory of the Holocaust, reminding future generations that silence and forgetting are the accomplices of evil. The site of Buchenwald itself did not disappear after the war. The Soviet Union, which occupied eastern Germany, turned the camp into a detention facility for political prisoners, Nazi collaborators, and others deemed enemies of the new regime. Thousands were held there between 1945 and 1950, and many died from disease, malnutrition, and mistreatment. This second chapter in Buchenwald's history remains a subject of controversy, a reminder that the end of one tyranny does not guarantee the absence of another. By the 1950s, the camp had been transformed again, this time into a memorial. Survivors played a key role in shaping its design and purpose. They insisted that Buchenwald should not become a place of vengeance or bitterness, but a site of remembrance and education. Monuments were erected to honor the dead. Museums were built to preserve the evidence of Nazi crimes. Schoolchildren, historians, and political leaders visited the site to confront the realities of the past. The roll call square, where prisoners once stood for hours in freezing weather, became a place of solemn reflection. The Buchenwald Memorial, inaugurated in 1958, bore the inscription, Den Opfern des Faschismus, to the victims of fascism. It was more than a tribute. It was a warning carved in stone. As the decades passed, the memorial evolved to include not only the victims of Nazism, but also those who suffered under Soviet repression. Today, Buchenwald stands as a complex historical site, a testament to the cyclical nature of human cruelty and the resilience of those who resist it. The lessons of Buchenwald have been woven into the broader narrative of the Holocaust, but they also transcend it. The camp's history illustrates how authoritarian regimes exploit fear and prejudice to dehumanize entire groups of people. It shows how ordinary individuals, guards, doctors, bureaucrats, can become complicit in atrocities when ideology blinds them to the humanity of others. And it demonstrates how, even in the darkest conditions, human beings can organize, resist, and preserve their dignity. One of the most powerful symbols of that resistance is the Buchenwald Oath, sworn by survivors just days after liberation. Standing in the place where they had once been counted like cattle, they declared, "We will take up the struggle until the last traces of fascism have been destroyed and the perpetrators have been punished. Our ideal is the building of a new world, of peace and freedom. This is our oath before all the world." Those words continue to resonate today. They remind us that the fight against tyranny did not end with the fall of the Third Reich. The ideologies that built Buchenwald, hatred, racism, intolerance, authoritarianism, still exist, sometimes in new forms, sometimes hiding behind new slogans. Remembering Buchenwald is not an act of mourning alone. It is an act of vigilance. Over the decades, Buchenwald has also become a center for scholarly research and public dialogue. Historians have pored over thousands of documents recovered from the camp, reconstructing the intricate bureaucracy that sustained it. Sociologists and psychologists have studied the behavior of perpetrators and bystanders, seeking to understand how ordinary people could commit extraordinary evil. Survivors have shared their testimonies in books, documentaries, and classrooms, turning their suffering into a tool for education. One recurring theme in this research is the banality of evil, a phrase coined by political theorist Hannah Arendt during the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Buchenwald embodies that concept. The camp was not the work of monstrous individuals alone. It was the product of a system in which cruelty became routine and killing became administrative. Guards clocked in for their shifts, filled out paperwork, and went home to their families. Doctors experimented on prisoners in the morning and dined with friends in the evening. The machinery of genocide functioned not because of madness, but because of obedience, indifference, and ideology. Yet Buchenwald also embodies another truth, that humanity can survive even in the face of absolute dehumanization. The underground resistance, the hidden children, the shared scraps of bread. These acts of defiance were small in scale, but monumental in significance. They prove that even when the world seems lost, the capacity for compassion, solidarity, and moral courage endures. In the decades since 1945, countless visitors have walked through the gates of Buchenwald. Many have described the experience as transformative. Standing before the crematorium, walking through the barracks, reading the names of the dead, it is impossible not to feel the weight of history pressing down. And yet, that weight is also a call to action. It demands that we remember, that we teach, that we confront the forces of hatred wherever they appear. The day the gates opened was not just a moment of liberation for those imprisoned inside. It was a moment of awakening for humanity itself. It forced the world to look directly at the consequences of unchecked hatred and to reckon with its own capacity for evil. And it challenged future generations to ensure that such a place could never exist again. But memory alone is not enough. The survivors of Buchenwald knew this. They understood that remembrance must be paired with action, with a commitment to human rights, to justice, to solidarity with the oppressed. Their legacy is not confined to memorials and history books. It lives on in every effort to build a world where dignity is universal and hatred has no home. As the decades rolled forward, the legacy of Buchenwald continued to evolve, shaping international law, political thought, and collective memory. The liberation of the camp was not just a military victory, it was a moral reckoning that reverberated far beyond the borders of Germany. It forced humanity to confront uncomfortable truths about itself, about the fragility of civilization, the ease with which prejudice can metastasize into genocide, and the complicity of silence. In the immediate aftermath of the war, those truths formed the foundation for a new global order. The revelations from Buchenwald and other camps were instrumental in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, a landmark document that enshrined the inherent dignity and equality of every person. It was also a driving force behind the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Conventions, and the establishment of the United Nations itself. The phrase "never again," born from the ashes of the Holocaust, became a guiding principle for a world desperate to avoid repeating its darkest chapter. Yet, as history has shown, that vow has been tested time and again. In the decades since Buchenwald's liberation, genocides have occurred in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur. Each time, the world has promised once more that it has learned its lesson, and each time, the lesson has been betrayed. Buchenwald thus stands not only as a monument to past horrors, but as a warning about the persistent capacity for cruelty that lurks within human societies. Remembering what happened there is not an act of nostalgia. It is a necessary defense against repetition. The survivors of Buchenwald were among the first to recognize this. Many devoted their lives to human rights activism, seeing in their suffering a moral imperative to speak out against injustice wherever it appeared. They visited schools, testified before governments, and participated in truth commissions. Some, like Elie Wiesel, became global voices of conscience, reminding the world that indifference is not neutrality, but complicity. The opposite of love is not hate, Wiesel once said. It is indifference. His words echoed the silent choices that allowed Buchenwald to exist, the neighbors who looked away, the bureaucrats who followed orders, the governments that refused to act. Buchenwald also played a crucial role in the field of Holocaust education. From the 1960s onward, the camp became a destination for school groups, historians, and dignitaries. Survivors returned to tell their stories to new generations, often standing in the very barracks where they had once suffered. Their testimonies transformed the abstract horror of genocide into something deeply personal and immediate. It was no longer just history, it was memory, lived and transmitted. The memorial site itself grew and changed as Germany confronted its past. During the Cold War, the East German government emphasized the suffering of political prisoners while downplaying the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. After reunification in 1990, efforts were made to present a fuller, more accurate picture of the camp's history. Exhibitions were updated, new research centers were established, and space was created for dialogue about the complexities of memory, guilt, and responsibility. Today, Buchenwald stands as a place of multifaceted remembrance, honoring victims, examining perpetrators, and exploring the broader social conditions that made the camp possible. A key component of that exploration is the question of how ordinary people became participants in extraordinary crimes. The guards and administrators at Buchenwald were not demons from another world. They were teachers, shopkeepers, farmers, and clerks. They were neighbors and fathers and sons. Their transformation from civilians to cogs in a killing machine is a chilling reminder that evil is often banal, that it thrives not on monstrousness, but on conformity, obedience, and the abdication of moral responsibility. One particularly haunting example is that of Ilse Koch, the wife of the camp's commandant, Karl Otto Koch. Known to prisoners as the Witch of Buchenwald, she was infamous for her sadism and cruelty. Witnesses testified that she selected inmates with distinctive tattoos to be murdered, so their skin could be turned into lampshades and book covers. Her actions were not those of a faceless bureaucrat, but of an individual who reveled in dehumanization. Ilse Koch was tried and sentenced to life in prison, a symbol of personal accountability amid a system that often sought to diffuse blame. The story of Buchenwald also forces us to examine the broader societal context that enabled it. Nazi ideology did not arise in a vacuum. It was built on centuries of anti-Semitism, racism, and authoritarianism. It exploited existing prejudices and amplified them through propaganda, education, and law. The lesson is clear. Genocide does not begin with gas chambers or crematoria. It begins with words, with stereotypes, scapegoating, and the slow erosion of empathy. When such ideas go unchallenged, they can lead inexorably to places like Buchenwald. This understanding has profound implications for the present. In a world still grappling with hatred, extremism, and authoritarianism, the story of Buchenwald is more relevant than ever. It teaches that democracy is fragile, that human rights must be defended constantly, and that silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of violence. It reminds us that vigilance is not paranoia. It is responsibility. The survivors knew this, too. Many of them emphasized the importance of bearing witness, not just to the past, but to the present. They warned of the dangers of dehumanizing language, of political movements that trade in fear and division, of societies that tolerate inequality and oppression. They understood that the seeds of future atrocities are often sown in the soil of apathy. Each year, on the anniversary of Buchenwald's liberation, ceremonies are held at the site. Survivors and their descendants gather alongside political leaders, educators, and young people from around the world. They lay wreaths, light candles, and read the names of the dead. But the most powerful moments often come not from speeches or rituals, but from silence, a silence that speaks of grief, resilience, and the weight of memory. That silence is also an invitation. It calls each generation to ask itself difficult questions. What would I have done? Would I have spoken out? Would I have resisted? These are not hypothetical exercises. They are tests of conscience, reminders that history is not just something that happened, it is something that can happen again. Even today, Buchenwald remains a living site of reflection. Scholars continue to unearth new documents, uncovering forgotten stories of victims and perpetrators alike. Artists and filmmakers reinterpret its legacy, challenging audiences to engage with its lessons in fresh ways. Activists draw on its history to combat contemporary forms of hatred and oppression. And descendants of survivors return, carrying with them the weight of memory and the responsibility of testimony. The day the gates opened was a beginning, not an end. It marked the start of a long and ongoing struggle. A struggle to remember, to understand, and to act. The shadows of Buchenwald still stretch across our world, a reminder of how far humanity can fall and how much work remains to prevent it from falling again. The echoes of Buchenwald reach far beyond the confines of history books or memorial walls. They resonate in the choices nations make, in the language politicians use, and in the moral decisions faced by ordinary people every day. Each new generation inherits not only the memory of the Holocaust, but also the responsibility to interpret and apply its lessons. The story of Buchenwald is not finished. It continues to unfold in the way humanity responds to injustice, prejudice, and tyranny in its own time. One of the most important legacies of Buchenwald is its role in shaping the field of transitional justice, the mechanisms societies use to reckon with past atrocities and prevent their recurrence. The Nuremberg trials, held shortly after the war, were directly informed by the evidence gathered from camps like Buchenwald. They established the principle that individuals, even heads of state, generals, and bureaucrats, could be held criminally responsible for crimes against humanity. This was a revolutionary concept, one that would influence international law for decades to come. The principles forged at Nuremberg have since guided tribunals for crimes in Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, and beyond. Each of these efforts, in some way, traces its lineage back to the revelations of Buchenwald and the determination that such crimes must never go unpunished. Justice, imperfect though it may be, is one of the few tools humanity has to assert its values in the aftermath of atrocity. But justice alone is not enough. Memory, too, is a vital part of prevention. The Holocaust taught the world that denial and distortion are not merely academic concerns, they are political weapons. Almost as soon as the camps were liberated, attempts were made to downplay or deny their reality. Nazi sympathizers, far-right extremists, and revisionist historians sought to rewrite the story. Some claimed the camps were labor facilities, not sites of mass murder. Others argued that the numbers were exaggerated, or that the victims had brought their suffering upon themselves. This denialism persists to this day, often dressed in pseudo-scholarship or disguised as political rhetoric. It is a second assault on the victims, an attempt to erase their suffering and absolve the perpetrators. That is why the evidence collected at Buchenwald, the testimonies of survivors, and the meticulous documentation by liberators remain so vital. They serve as a bulwark against lies and a foundation for truth. As Elie Wiesel warned, to forget a Holocaust is to kill twice. Education has become one of the most powerful weapons in this battle. Across the world, Buchenwald is taught not just as a chapter in German history, but as a universal lesson in the consequences of hatred. Museums, memorials, and curricula use the camp's history to spark conversations about racism, authoritarianism, and the fragility of democratic institutions. Students are not merely told what happened. They are asked to reflect on why it happened and what it means for the world they are inheriting. The camp's history also informs broader discussions about identity and belonging. Buchenwald was not just a place where Jews were persecuted, though they were the largest and most targeted group. It was also a site of suffering for political dissidents, trade unionists, Roma, Sinti, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and Soviet prisoners of war. Its victims came from dozens of countries and spoke dozens of languages. This diversity underscores a crucial truth. Genocide is not confined to a single ideology or a single group. It is a universal danger, one that can manifest wherever hatred is allowed to thrive. Survivor testimonies continue to illuminate the human dimension of this history. Consider the story of Marcel Reich-Ranicki, a Polish Jew deported to Buchenwald in 1944. He described the camp as a place where time had stopped, where the present was only suffering and the future was unimaginable. Or that of Robert Antelme, a French resistance fighter, who recalled the quiet acts of solidarity, a piece of bread shared, a whispered word of encouragement that helped him survive. These stories remind us that even in the depths of horror, humanity can persist in small, defiant gestures. There were also stories of extraordinary courage among the liberators. Many American soldiers were profoundly changed by what they witnessed at Buchenwald. Some dedicated their lives to fighting injustice at home and abroad. Others spoke publicly about the experience, ensuring that the world would never forget what they had seen. In their letters and diaries, they described scenes of unimaginable suffering, but also moments of resilience and hope. Prisoners embracing one another, singing songs of freedom, reclaiming their humanity in the very place designed to erase it. One of the most powerful moments after liberation came during the first roll call held by the freed prisoners themselves. No longer forced to stand in silence for hours under the watchful eyes of the SS, they gathered voluntarily in the square. There, instead of numbers being shouted by guards, names were read aloud. The names of the dead, the disappeared, the forgotten. It was a reclaiming of identity, a symbolic act of defiance against a system that had sought to reduce them to nothing. Buchenwald's story also holds lessons about the nature of resistance. The underground movement within the camp was one of the most organized in the entire concentration camp system. Prisoners sabotaged production, smuggled information, and even orchestrated the camp's liberation before the Americans arrived. This resistance did not always involve weapons or violence. Often, it was the quiet, persistent refusal to surrender one's humanity. In a world designed to crush the spirit, simply surviving, helping a fellow prisoner, or preserving a shred of dignity was itself an act of rebellion. These acts of resistance have inspired countless movements since. Civil rights activists in the United States, anti-apartheid campaigners in South Africa, and dissidents in Eastern Europe all drew on the lessons of Holocaust resistance. They understood that oppression thrives on silence and submission, and that even the smallest act of defiance can ripple outward, challenging systems of power. As the number of living survivors dwindles, the urgency of preserving their stories grows. In recent years, new technologies have emerged to aid this effort. Virtual reality tours, holographic testimonies, and digital archives are ensuring that future generations will be able to hear survivors speak in their own words. These innovations are not meant to replace the raw power of first-hand testimony, but to extend its reach beyond the limits of time. At the same time, the rise of authoritarianism and xenophobia in parts of the world has given Buchenwald's story renewed relevance. The warning it offers, that hatred left unchecked can destroy societies from within, feels more urgent than ever. Each new act of ethnic cleansing, each resurgence of anti-Semitism or racism, is a reminder that the lessons of Buchenwald remain unfinished business. The day the gates opened was, above all, a moment of truth. It stripped away illusions about the nature of evil and the capacity of human beings to inflict suffering on one another. But it also revealed the strength of the human spirit, the ability to endure, to resist, to hope. Buchenwald is not just a story of death and despair. It is also a story of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable will to survive. Today, standing before the rusted gates of Buchenwald, where the words, jedem das sein, to each his own, still loom above the entrance, one is struck by the unsettling contrast between the banality of the phrase and the enormity of the crimes committed within. It is a cruel reminder of how language itself can be twisted into a weapon, used to justify oppression and normalize atrocity. The camp may now be a memorial, but the questions it forces upon us remain as urgent as ever. How did this happen? Why did so many allow it? And how do we prevent it from happening again? Visitors who walk the grounds today encounter more than just remnants of buildings and rusting fences. They encounter the weight of millions of decisions, some small, some monumental, that together made Buchenwald possible. They see the barracks where men and women once clung to life in freezing darkness. They step into the crematorium, where the final indignities were visited upon the dead. They read the names etched into memorial plaques, and they realize that behind each name was a story, a family, a world destroyed. But they also encounter signs of resistance and resilience. They learn of the underground networks that risked everything to save lives. They see photographs of the secret schools, the clandestine religious services, the hidden children, each an act of defiance against the Nazi project of annihilation. They read the words of survivors who turned their suffering into testimony and their grief into warnings. In these stories lies a powerful truth. Even when humanity is stripped of everything, it doesn't disappear. Buchenwald's legacy extends into every conversation about human rights, justice, and memory in the modern world. It shapes how we think about refugees fleeing persecution, about governments that target minorities, about propaganda that sows division and fear. The lessons of the camp challenge us to recognize the early warning signs of genocide, the dehumanizing language, the scapegoating of vulnerable groups, the erosion of democratic norms, and to act before they culminate in catastrophe. They also challenge us to look inward. The men and women who ran Buchenwald were not monsters in the abstract sense. They were human beings who made choices that allowed them to participate in evil without seeing themselves as evil. They compartmentalized, rationalized, and obeyed. They convinced themselves that they were doing their duty, protecting their country, following orders. In their ordinariness lies the most terrifying lesson of all, that the capacity for cruelty exists in all of us. It is our moral responsibility to recognize it, confront it, and resist it, both in ourselves and in the societies we build. For survivors, the memory of Buchenwald was not just a burden, but a duty. Many described their testimony as a form of resistance, a way to deny the Nazis their final victory. They wanted us to disappear, one survivor said. By telling our story, we refuse to let them win. This act of remembrance is itself a form of justice, a way of restoring dignity to those who were stripped of it, and ensuring that their suffering is not forgotten. And yet, as the decades pass and the last witnesses fade, that responsibility increasingly falls to those who were not there. It is a responsibility not just to remember, but to remember truthfully, to resist the temptations of simplification, denial, or distortion. History must be told in all its complexity, with all its uncomfortable questions and inconvenient truths intact. Only then can it serve as a true guide for the future. There is a profound paradox at the heart of Buchenwald's story. It is a place built to destroy life, yet it continues to give meaning to life today. It is a site of death, yet it teaches us how to live. It shows us the depths of human cruelty, yet it also reveals the heights of human courage. It is both a scar and a beacon, a scar that reminds us of what was lost, and a beacon that lights the way toward a more just and compassionate world. Every year, new generations visit Buchenwald, school children from Germany, students from the United States, researchers from around the world. They come to learn, to mourn, to bear witness. And each of them carries something away from that experience, a renewed sense of responsibility, a deeper understanding of history, a commitment to ensuring that never again is more than just a slogan. They understand that remembrance is not passive, it is active. It demands vigilance, courage, and action. Buchenwald's story has also inspired countless works of art, literature, and film, creative responses that seek to grapple with the enormity of what happened there. Some, like Weasel's Night, speak directly from the experience of survival. Others, like the documentaries and memorial installations created in the decades since, invite audiences to confront their own relationship to history. These works do not offer closure, for there can be no closure, but they do offer connection, empathy, and the possibility of transformation. Even as the physical traces of the camp weather and fade, the memory endures. It lives in the stories told by survivors, in the lessons taught in classrooms, in the memorial ceremonies held each April. It lives in the international laws and institutions built to prevent future atrocities. And it lives in the choices we make every day, whether to speak out or stay silent, to embrace or to hate, to build bridges or walls. The day the gates of Buchenwald opened, the world was forced to confront the consequences of its own failures. Its failure to stop Hitler before it was too late. Its failure to respond to early warnings. Its failure to protect the vulnerable. But it was also a day when humanity, battered and bloodied, took a step toward redemption. It was a day when the survivors' suffering was finally acknowledged, when the truth could no longer be hidden, when the possibility of justice, however imperfect, became real. Today, as we face new challenges, rising authoritarianism, renewed anti-Semitism, violent nationalism, the memory of Buchenwald stands as both a warning and a guide. It reminds us that hatred does not vanish on its own. It must be confronted. It reminds us that democracy is fragile. It must be defended. It reminds us that silence is never neutral. It always favors the oppressor. And it reminds us that the fight for human dignity is never over. The gates of Buchenwald opened on April 11, 1945, but they must continue to open, in classrooms, in parliaments, in hearts and minds around the world. They must open to truth, to justice, to empathy. They must open to a future where never again is not a plea, but a promise kept. The final lesson of Buchenwald is not despair, but responsibility. It is the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, human beings have choices, and that those choices matter. It is the understanding that history is not inevitable, but shaped by the actions of individuals and societies. And it is the conviction that by remembering the past honestly and courageously, we can build a future worthy of those who suffered and died behind those gates. The day the gates opened, the world changed. It cannot, and must not, ever go back.